Australia sat on the top of the global income ladder for the best part of the 19th century and then blew what I think was its first chance. It's taken 70 years to get back to this, its second chance, where it's got an open economy with a population sourced from all over the world. The second chance, the way I define it, is the opportunity to take the position we're in now and make something great of the country. But the difficulty at the moment, given our history, is that we have been in this position once before and we blew it. So the second chance is the opportunity not to repeat the mistake of the past when we turn inward the last time around. The big question about what migration does for Australia is always framed up until now, I think, in terms of cultural contribution. And most people will look at migration, and look, even people like Malcolm Fraser used to say this to me privately, migrants have brought great food to Australia. Now the question of the cultural contribution, it's a very, very substantial question, but it's actually off the point in terms of Australia's history. Australia is in essence a migrant nation, and Australia's periods of greatest prosperity are associated with mass migration, big open migration programs. The British, the Irish, the Europeans and even the Chinese in the 19th century, and since the end of the Second World War, people sourced from all corners of the globe. The periods of Australia's greatest weakness, economic malaise, social disorder, especially around the time of the First World War and in the 1920s, is actually associated with racial selection and restricted migration. So the bigger question is, what does migration bring to Australia? Its absence brings Australia down. Its involvement in the national story actually allows Australia to achieve probably its full potential. Now the Americans look at migration very, very simply. Migrants literally made the United States. We never look at it that way. We look at it in a slightly different perspective. We are more worried about what the migrant might do wrong. So a lot of the onus is on the migrant to fit in. But in essence, what I've been trying to do with this book is not so much reframe our national story, but just test the other proposition, whether Australia works better as a migrant nation, whether it works as a nation that tries to control its destiny. Now, the nation that tries to control its destiny actually ends up blowing it. Rich countries do have this particular paradox where it is actually expensive to live. Now, Australia is, after 24 years of uninterrupted growth, in this position that the rest of the world envies, but to the Australian is actually quite a difficult position to be in. The cost of living, a good middle class life in Australia has never been more expensive, so property prices have gone up through the roof. Our cities are getting to a point where they're difficult to move around in. Our education system is no longer this sort of great public good, it's now more slanted towards private provision. There's a sense that the centre of Australia isn't the safest place to be anymore. There's obviously a lot of upside if you're one of the globally connected Australians, but there's a lot of downside if you fall off the middle rung. So something as simple as coffee prices tells you that the country is at the top of a very, very long boom. Now our history tells us when you get to the top of these booms, one of two things can happen. Either it can keep going for another 20 years, because Australia is capable of very, very long runs of prosperity. Best part of the 19th century, it was the richest country on earth. For a good part of the 50s and 60s it grew uninterrupted, and we've been growing uninterrupted now for 24 years. But we're at this tipping point now where if things are feeling expensive, it means that something's about to blow. Hopefully it won't blow into a full-blown recession, but things are obviously very difficult for people at the moment. You asked me a personal question about whether we should let the boats in. Yes, let them in, because the person who wants to take that trip is motivated. And in fact, more likely than not, that person, they talk about them as economic migrants. Well, if they've got a skill set, let them in. But I understand there's a national anxiety about border control, and unregulated migration does not have popular support. But in Australia, large-scale migration does have popular support. So if that's the price to pay for maintaining a big immigration program, well, personally, I would let the boats in. I think if they don't come, but we're still sourcing a good proportion of our intake from refugee camps, that may well be the happy medium you'd want to strike. Look, leadership has been pretty poor for the last few years in Australia on both sides of politics, and I think politicians on both sides would admit to that. It's actually a very interesting time for an author in the non-fiction space. I think you can be a realist in the short term, which can be read as pessimism, but you can be an optimist about the long term. So I think in a period of leadership instability, it's probably a good time to be writing these sorts of books. The book you'd never want to be caught writing, I suspect, is the one that is doing the backslapping just at the tipping point when your country's about to go down the gurgler. And I think there are a few books like that in human history that have been written in a number of societies. And I know we would have had some books like that written, not necessarily Donald Horne, which was a different take, but there are a few triumphalist books written about Australia in the 60s. And there might have even been a few triumphalist books written at the beginning of the 21st century by writers of certain ilk. But at the moment now, everything's up for grabs, and I think when there's a contest of ideas, it's not a bad time to be in the non-fiction game. The only thing I'd say, and I'm very conscious of this with this particular book, because I'm writing into the present tense, I don't want to be making a prediction in the short term, because you can get caught really, really quickly. So if I had Tony Abbott as an active voice, and he was Prime Minister Tony Abbott, and the book was premised on Tony Abbott still being Prime Minister when it was released, this book wouldn't have had a very long shelf life. We decided this very early on because we had a lot of history in the book. So the operating assumption for all leaders was that they were dead, not in a literary sense that they were dead. They were all past tense. So whilst you're using active voice from them, direct quotes, you had to assume that you were talking about a period in history that had passed, and you're using your history as an interpretive tool for present and future. So it's a good time to write, as long as you remember that particular caveat, that you can't make a prediction about the present, and in a period of absolute leadership turmoil, you can never be certain who your Prime Minister is the day you publish.